Well, hello, and welcome to this Berkley Center webinar on Faith in the Crossfire, the Religious Dimensions of Sudan's Civil War. My name is Judd Birdsall. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And today we're going to be discussing a recent report published by the Berkley Center on the war in Sudan, which has led to one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world today. Tens of thousands killed, millions displaced, risk of famine, a catastrophe on so many levels. This report looks at religious demographics and dynamics in Sudan and how those factors shape the conflict and the civilian response to the conflict. I'm delighted that we have the report's author, Janette Yarwood, with us, alongside two religious peace-building experts, Mohamed Elsanousi and Palwasha Kakar. I'll introduce all of our panelists more fully in just a moment. A quick word about what brings us together. This webinar is being hosted by the Strategic Religious Engagement Hub, or SRE Hub, at the Berkley Center. 3 years ago, the religion team at the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP, launched a new series of reports called the Religion, Peace, and Conflict Country Profiles, or RPACCs for short. And the idea was to provide brief, timely, accessible analysis of religion and conflict dynamics in certain countries that was accessible to diplomats and to other international affairs practitioners. As you may be aware, last year, the Trump administration fired nearly all of the staff of USIP. There's an ongoing legal case, so we don't know what the future holds for the U.S. Institute of Peace. But for now, all those resources that were generated by USIP over decades, and including in recent years by the religion team, are no longer accessible on the USIP website. So last year at the Berkley Center, we launched this SRE, Strategic Religious Engagement Hub, to make these sorts of resources produced by USIP and by U.S. government agencies, once again accessible to policymakers and to the wider public. Our aim in this hub is to support the capacity of the U.S. government to analyze religious dynamics, to engage religious actors across the fields of diplomacy, development, and defense. And as part of that mission, we're delighted to be able to extend USIP's RPACC series, and it's now available on the Berkley Center website. Today, we're launching the latest RPACC, this one on Sudan. In just a moment, we'll begin our conversation with the panel. After about 30 minutes or so of chat among us, we'll open the floor for Q&A. So be thinking about questions you'd want to pose to our panelists. You can type your question at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please do be brief in phrasing your question. Typically, the shorter it is, the more likely it is to get asked. And if you have a particular or specific panelist in mind for your question, be sure to specify who you're addressing your question to. This webinar is being recorded, and the video will be posted on the Berkley Center website and on YouTube in the next few days. Well, let me introduce our panelist now. As I mentioned, the author of this report on Sudan is Janette Yarwood. She's a cultural anthropologist and policy practitioner whose work examines governance, political life, and public institutions across Africa. She's currently based at Yale University, where she's the director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa in the Office of International Affairs. She was previously at the U.S. State Department, where she was a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And she's also served on Capitol Hill, where she was a staff director for the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa. Our panel, as I mentioned, also includes Mohamed Elsanousi and Palwasha Kakar. Mohamed is the executive director of the Network of Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. He was until very recently a commissioner with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and he's involved in all sorts of interfaith initiatives in Washington and around the world, and pertinent for our discussion today, originally from Sudan. Palwasha Kakar was my colleague briefly at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she served for several years as the director of the Religion and Inclusive Societies Project at USIP. She's now a member of the Strategic Religious Engagement Hub Advisory Board, and she brings extensive experience on religious peace building, particularly focused on Afghanistan and South Asia, as well as across the Middle East and North Africa region. So, Janette, Mohammed, and Palwasha, a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us in conversation today. Janette, I'd love to start with you as the author of the report. Thank you for producing this report. Some of our listeners, no doubt, are expert on Sudan. Others, perhaps more like myself, have less familiarity with the country. I wonder if you could just open for us by orienting us to the situation there in Sudan. At the outset of the report, you made clear that this is not a sectarian war. It's not about religion per se. Some even wonder if it's about anything at all. Last year, I remember reading Anne Applebaum's article on Sudan in The Atlantic that was entitled The War About Nothing. You've been working on African affairs for a long time. What is the Sudanese civil war principally about?
Sure. Well, first, let me just say thank you for having me here today for, having me write this report, and hosting this session. And I thank my colleagues for being here, with us today as well. So let me start out by, really by saying Sudan's war is not a war about nothing, right? I mean, we know that. Those of us who watch Sudan, who watch Africa, absolutely know that. It's a war about power. It's a war about the state. It's a war about who gets to control the institutions of coercion and governance. And at its core, it's a struggle over who commands the security forces, who controls territory, who controls resources and revenue, and ultimately who gets to shape Sudan's political future. But let me take us back a little bit to just say, to understand the war, I think it's important to remember that it emerged from the collapse of Sudan's fragile post-Bashir transition. Omar al-Bashir, who had ruled Sudan for nearly 30 years between 1989 and 2019, leaving behind a political system deeply shaped by military and security institutions. After Bashir was removed in 2019, Sudan faced a central challenge that many transitional states face. How do you move from military rule to a more civilian political order when multiple armed institutions retain significant power? That question, in my opinion, was never fully resolved. Tensions between the Sudanese armed forces and rapid support forces grew over issues around authority, integration, command, and the future structure of the state. The result was not simply a personal rivalry between generals. It was a struggle over the future political order, in my opinion, of Sudan itself. The tragedy is that while the conflict began as a contest among powerful actors, ordinary Sudanese have paid the price. As you started by saying, millions have been displaced, entire communities have been uprooted, and much of the country's social and economic infrastructure has been devastated. So I would say Sudan's war is not about nothing. It's, to sum up, it's a war about power, state authority, and the future of Sudan's political order. But for many Sudanese, everyday life, it's also a struggle over survival and the possibility of the future after the war.
Well, thanks so much, Janet, for orienting us to the situation. So it's not a sectarian conflict, as you say. It's about power. It's about control of state resources and so on, and who gets to wield coercive power. But I wonder if you could help us now understand what roles, complex roles, dynamic roles, religion is playing in Sudan. How is it fueling both violence and peace in the country?
Sure, and that really gets at the heart of the report. So let me start out by reiterating exactly what you said, that it's absolutely, it's not a sectarian conflict, right? And that would be simplifying it. It's not a war between Muslims and Christians, nor is it fundamentally a conflict about theology or religious doctrine. The war's worst violence is better understood, as I said, that struggle over state power, over territory, over resources in a state weakened by decades of authoritarian rule, corruption, and failed political bargains. But ultimately, religion is used strategically, as sort of in other cases, ethnicity or religion. These things get used strategically by these actors. Religion matters in this case, and it matters, in important ways because it remains a source of legitimacy and social organization. On the violence side, religion can function as a tool for legitimacy and polarization. Political and armed actors in Sudan have long used religious language to frame political projects, portray opponents as threats to the social order, and to justify exclusion. Through my research, and what the research suggests is that actors linked to the former Islamist movement continue to draw on some of these narratives as they position themselves for influence in Sudan's post-war future. But that does not make it a religious war, and it does not mean but it does mean that religious language and religious institutions can become part of that broader struggle for power and authority. Yet, at the same time, religion is also helping communities survive this conflict. One of the strongest findings of the report in my research is that churches, mosques, faith leaders, as my colleagues I'm sure will highlight, and religious networks are functioning as part of Sudan's survival infrastructure. They're providing shelter, distributing food, aid, sharing information, reconnecting displaced families, and documenting abuses. And they're also helping communities maintain social ties amid extraordinary violence and institutional collapse. The report also documents how faith-based and interfaith peace building is underway and already underway. Organizations such as the African Council of Religious Leaders, Religions for Peace, and a couple of other organizations have convened interfaith engagement across ceasefire. Interfaith engagement. They've issued ceasefire appeals and work to counter narratives that really try to foster that division. And that's, really an important factor here. Networks such as the Sudan Ecumenical Forum and the World Council on Churches have also documented abuses, advocated for civilian protection, and helped sustain international attention on the conflict, which is clearly important. We keep calling it this forgotten war. Religious leaders have also participated in local mediation efforts in places where state authority has fragmented. So I would not frame religion as either a source of violence or as just simply a source of peace. Rather, religion is one of the areas in which Sudan's broader political struggle is being contested, but it can also be, it's also mobilized to legitimize exclusionary political projects and to sustain communities and support mediation to help protect civilians. For me, the policy lesson is not to assume religion explains the war, because it does not. The lesson is that religion continues to shape how legitimacy is claimed, how communities survive, and how different actors are positioning themselves for Sudan's future. And understanding that distinction is really important, so that it doesn't get utilized, religion doesn't get utilized or positioned, I would say, incorrectly when one is looking at this war.
Thanks, Janette. One quick follow-up question before I bring in our other panelists, and that is, I found it sort of interesting and tragic in your report how the very reasons that religious institutions, religious facilities are able to be sources of humanitarian aid and comfort and solace also makes them particularly vulnerable. Can you just say a word about that dual reality of religion or religious sites in Sudan?
Sure. So I'm gonna use examples on both ends, I would say. So I'm gonna, when I think about, Christian communities are certainly facing real vulnerabilities in some areas. But it's not because they're Christian, right? It is because those spaces are actually housing folks, right? And so then they become targets. They become targets by some of these armed actors. It's churches, it's mosques, it's schools, it's clinics, right? So all of these spaces, are the spaces that are really helping civilians, but they ultimately end up being targeted. And so that becomes, that's one of the ways why we have to really think about how to protect these actors. I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more of this. I'm going to give my colleagues a chance to speak, but I have a couple of other examples, really concrete examples that looks at how religious institutions and sites on both sides, both Christian and Muslim, the mosques have been targeted.
Thanks. Mohammed, I want to bring you into the conversation. This is obviously a really personal issue for you, being Sudanese, being born in Sudan. I'd just be curious if you could just share what reflections you have on the current state of the conflict and maybe something about what your organization, the Network of Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, has done to try to foster peace and mediation in the country.
Thank you so much, Judd. It's really appreciate it. It's always nice to see you. And thank you for hosting this. I appreciate the Berkley Center and particularly the Strategic Religious Engagement Hub and what you guys are doing to collect what we have accomplished in the past decades, so that we can build on it. I appreciate that. Wonderful to be with my friends Palwasha as well as with you, Janette Yarwood. And I appreciate your report and reflection on the conflict, in Sudan. Yes, Judd, as you said, it's personal for me. I am originally from the Sudan. I was born and raised in a village in Sudan, in Kordofan in particular. So it's really sad to see what is happening in the beautiful country that I was born and raised in. Just to mention a couple of things as we move forward, my reflections in the current conflict of Sudan, Janet kind of described what's happening right now and the role of religious actors and religious institutions and the interreligious communities as well in terms of what they are doing on the ground. There is one aspect that I really hope that Janet would have also mentioned that in her report, and that is the regional dynamic of the conflict. And that's something important because this conflict, unfortunately, is fueled by some of the interests from the region and from the globe. And the victims are the Sudanese people, the Sudan as a country, as the civilian communities. So that regional dynamics actually what kept this actually conflict going. We know the Sudanese people very well. I was raised there, and I know the religion is not a question in Sudan. And Janet, absolutely correct. The conflict is not sectarian, is not a religious conflict, but unfortunately, as we have seen in other contexts, actually in Africa, usually religion is exploited, right? And the role of religious actors are exploited when we come and see such kind of conflict. So religion is not an issue for the Sudanese people. They have been living together peacefully. We don't know who is a Christian, who is a Muslim as well in some of the contexts. So that's not a question. But I would say that the role of religious actors and religious communities and religious institutions still continue to be underutilized in terms of their role in the society in Sudan, particularly in this conflict. That's why the USIP and the network, we engage in engaging religious actors and trying to solicit their ideas, their contribution, and what they can do on the ground. So in our engagement with the Sudanese religious actors at the highest level in the past several years, we were able to create for them a platform so that they can meet and talk, all right? They have identified a number of issues that are, critical for them, especially at this time of the war. Issues like of, the rising hate speech, for instance, that need to be addressed. Second, their counsel and what is resulted in the war. There are a number of issues, the trauma, the mental health situations. As Janet mentioned, their institutions are very critical right now in terms of providing essentials for those who are in need, using their houses of worship as a places so that they can provide also humanitarian needs as well. My understanding also, I'm glad that Janet mentioned the role of Religions for Peace and the African Interreligious Council and what they have done in that region. I know they have engaged the Sudanese communities and religious actors in particular in a number of meetings so that they can see what role could play. So I think just to conclude, to say that I think the potential is huge. religious leadership still enjoy a trust of within the two parties, from the president, the Burhan, and the RSF. Both parties actually respect the critical role of religious leaders, but what we are lacking a meaningful mechanism so that we can actually use that role for peace in Sudan.
Thank you, Mohamed. That's a good segue to the question I wanted to pose to Palwasha to bring her into the conversation. Palwasha, you have deep experience and expertise in the region, and I want to acknowledge it was your vision in the first place for commissioning an RPAC report on Sudan that has brought us to this moment. So I'd be curious if you could just share a bit about what was the vision for commissioning a report on Sudan. What was going on at the time in terms of your desire to bring religious actors into peace-building efforts focused on Sudan?
Thank you so much, Judd. And thank you to the Berkley Center and the SRE Hub for continuing our work that we had started at USIP. Judd, you were part of that conversation, as Peter was as well, in terms of starting these religion, peace, and conflict country profiles. And I'm really grateful that you're continuing this work at the Berkley Center. And I also wanted to thank the Network of Religious and Traditional Peacemakers and Brother Mohamed for collaborating with us on the religious landscape mapping. That's a broader mapping that we've been doing, and some of the initial conversations that he mentioned that we did with Religions for Peace and Inclusive Peace with Tanya Poffenholtz, and of course Imam Majid from MFNN, which actually brought some of the initial conversations forward on the role of religion in the Sudanese context and why it was so important. So a couple of years back, we were actually doing research on the role of religious actors in Track 1 peace processes. We reframed that into the role of religious actors in official peace processes because their role is so varied and enter at different points. And at that time, we were looking at not only ways to look backward in historical context, but also ways of looking forward in terms of which contexts we could follow and work with to follow the role of religious actors in official peace processes and Track 1 peace processes. And Sudan came up as a really important conflict context where the role of religious actors were very important, continue to be very important in terms of having legitimacy on both sides, in terms of describing the grievances. And so the impetus for us to continue to work on this issue and to really look in depth at the role of religious actors and the role of religion stemmed from that point. And we've had some work that we were able to move forward prior to USIP closing down. And I've been really grateful to see that our partners have been able to move this forward. You yourself, Judd, and also I know the network has been moving forward these conversations that Brother Mohamed Elsanousi has also been mentioning.
Thanks, Palwasha. And I wonder if we could zoom in on particularly the major Islamic networks in the country. What have you seen or are you seeing in terms of different Sufi orders and so on, and how they are cutting across the conflict and how that all then, as Mohamed, I think, referenced, how that cuts across so many other dynamics of ethnicity, regional differences, and so on. Can you help us better understand what's going on within the Muslim community in Sudan?
Sure. So overall, there have been a number of mappings, both the mapping that we did with the network and also a mapping that other local NGOs have been doing. And I've been following this carefully to try and understand how the different religious institutions and religious actors have been supporting the different sides of the conflict, the RSF and the SAF. Like you mentioned, it's also regional and it's also tribal and ethnic. We know that the Ansar remains influential in communities historically associated with the Ummah tradition. The Khatmiya remains important among the in Eastern Sudan and among those constituencies. The Khatmiya are part of that in terms of being very influential in Eastern Sudan. The Tijaniya networks are particularly influential in Darfur and Kordofan. We have the Samaniya and Qadriya. These are other Sufi networks that maintain influence in other regions. So religious legitimacy is tied to not just being part of these orders, but also where you fall tribally, regionally, and in your social networks. So I think we've discussed a little bit about the role of religion being not what mainly drives this conflict, but there are really important trends that I think are important to continue to follow. Um, as Janette's paper rightly notes, it's not fundamentally a religious war. It's a struggle over power, over governance, over territory, and over resources. And religion is really relevant because it shapes how communities understand authority, how they're understanding justice, how they're understanding belonging, and their place within the Sudanese state. So what I see are three broad trends. First, that religious identity overlaps with the regional and historical grievances, and that's not something to take lightly. Understanding the historical and regional grievances are really a key in understanding what the roles and how the religious communities are making meaning of the situation that can drive the conflict, but also can support peace building. So in places like Darfur and parts of Kordofan, many communities view the conflict through the lens of long-standing exclusion from the Khartoum-centered political and economic power. And religious institutions, and I would say particularly the Sufi networks, are often embedded within those regional and tribal communities. So while the grievances aren't theological, they are frequently expressed through religious and social institutions that have carried these community or communal narratives for generations. So, secondly, we see increasing fragmentation within the Sudanese landscape, religious landscape. So historically, the movements such as the Ansar, the Khatamiyya, the Tijaniyya, the Qadariyya, and the Samaniyya provided important sources of social cohesion and identity. But today, authority is very decentralized. So there's different sheikhs, there's different zawiyas, and different local leaders that take on positions depending on the local realities of the conflict, the security conditions, and what the community needs. So this means that as we look towards peace building, we should avoid speaking about any movement as a single unified actor or institution, and really look at the influential religious actors that are at the local level working on these issues rather than at the national level. And thirdly, religion continues to serve as a source of meaning, belonging, and legitimacy during wartime. And this was mentioned as well by Janette in terms of the importance of legitimacy. And one of the definitions we use at USIP is that religion is a human response to questions of meaning, purpose, and ultimate reality that is organized through communities, institutions, and rituals. So in Sudan today, religious institutions are helping communities answer these questions, such as, why is this happening? Who can we trust? How should we respond? What does justice look like? They're not just theological questions, they're also political and social questions, but they're based in religious realities and people's religious understandings. So when we look at major religious movements, it's the most important insight to see not just whether they support one side or the other, but it is how they continue to provide networks of belonging, narratives of meaning, sources of legitimacy that shape how communities understand the conflict and also the possibilities for peace.
Thank you, Palwasha. That's incredibly helpful. Now, every RPAC has a fairly standard format, and one of the sections that they all have is a section on religious freedom in the particular country. And we have with us a recent commissioner from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Mohamed Elsanousi. Thank you for your service on that commission. Sudan was for many years designated as a CPC, a country of particular concern, for its particularly severe violations of religious freedom. From the time that the very first designations were made in 1999 up until the fall of Bashir in 2019, Sudan was listed as a CPC alongside the North Koreas of the world, the worst of the worst. Then it was taken off the list after some reforms, but then just this year, in the U.S. Commission's annual report, they recommend that the State Department not redesignate Sudan as a country of particular concern, but designate the Rapid Support Force as an entity of particular concern, a group that has violated religious freedom as a non-state actor. So I'm curious, Mohamed, what reflections you have in terms of how the lack of religious freedom or low levels of religious freedom, the unhelpful intertwining of state power and religious power have fostered conditions that made this civil war possible, and what could be done in terms of religious freedom reforms to make Sudan a more stable, more cohesive country?
Thank you so much, Judd. I appreciate that question here. And I want to say that as we know, religious freedom is really important as a foundation for political stability, and as well as for countries to flourish. We have a number of researches and a number of studies, have proven that when countries that enjoy religious freedom, they are better, prosperous economically, the social cohesion is strong, and the political institutions are stable as well. And when religious freedom is not basically observed or is not in that country, then we'll see the opposite, right? So that's why when I was serving at USIP, we look into Sudan. And you are absolutely correct. In the past, during the first Trump administration, they engaged with Sudan, and they were able actually to remove Sudan from the countries of particular concern. And since then, and that happened because Sudan did some reforms in their laws, particularly laws that related to apostasy and blasphemy laws. There was a roadmap created, and Sudan followed that clearly. And at the end, they got removed from that. In the past several years, we started at USIP, our able analysts, they look into Sudan because there were some rumors that Sudan, they brought back all the blasphemy laws and apostasy laws and all of that, and we look into that closely, but that was not there was no evidence to support that, so they did not bring those laws back, right? But we also, our researchers and analysts, look into the violation of religious freedom. And particularly, they look into the RSF because we have in the law of the 1998, when you look into religious freedom law, and for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom to recommend designation of countries of particular concerns or entities of particular concerns. And the entities of particular concern, those entities who are basically controlling a piece of land and committing some atrocity crimes, such as, we recommended ISIS in the countries of entities of particular concern. We recommended Al-Shabaab, the Houthis and others. So then USIP look into what's happening, particularly some of the atrocities that was committed by RSF. Killing of worshippers, for instance. These are cases reported in Al-Fashir when people were praying Muslim prayer in the early morning prayers, and the drone killed about 70 people, right? Look into also some of the atrocities and religious freedom violation happened to the Christian communities in Medani, for instance, in other places. That's why it is established evidence that the actions of the RSF basically met all the criteria of led to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom to recommend that the RSF should be designated as an entity of particular concern. I mean, I'm saying all of this, but looking really just back into the history of Sudan and the way that I see Sudan, there is no issue of Muslim versus Christians and all that. I mean, that's not non-existence, right? I will just close with the story. As I mentioned to you earlier, yet that I grew up in a village, and my father had a small shop in the village, and he used to bring some goods from the capital of Kordofan, Al-Ubayd. And I used to go with him, and then he said that, let's go to your Uncle Morris. Go to your Uncle Morris. So we went to our Uncle Morris, who is a Coptic Christian, I don't know, isn't Uncle Morris a Christian or a Muslim, right? I didn't even ask that question, but he just said, go to Uncle Morris, right? So that's to tell you that to personalize how people in Sudan actually live, whether they're Christian and Muslims. But unfortunately, the situation of the war, which has led to all of this, what's happening. I also saw recently there was an effort from the government, Burhan government, is actually to extend strengthening relationship with the Christian communities. I saw some of the news. The president, I think, visited some of the churches recently, as Coptic churches as well. But still, we hear some, religious violations also reported by the Sudanese National Council of Churches as well. So at the time of war, you will see all of that happening. But one of the things actually was positive was done during the the transition period, the Hamdok period, was actually a conference of interfaith conference that took place in Sudan. And the network, my network, we went there and we supported that efforts, brought Sudanese Christians, even from the Nuba Mountains, from, the braveries, in Khartoum and other places, and engage in an interfaith discussion. I think these kind of positive initiatives, I think we should build on those initiatives so that we can continue to strengthen the social fabric of the country.
Thank you, Mohamed, for those insights. Let me just remind the audience to begin putting your questions forward for our panelists by clicking, is it the Q&A button or the chat button at the bottom of your screen, so we can begin reviewing those questions. Be brief if you can be, and let us know to which panelist you're addressing your question. A few quick questions for me to wrap up this portion, mostly looking ahead. Janette, you've been following African affairs for a long time. How does this conflict end, or how might it end? Does one side just need to decisively defeat the other, or is there some other settlement that might bring an end to the violence?
Judd, I fear that I'm not going to satisfy your question, because I am not one of those folks that likes to really be predictive. I'm looking at the situation as it exists, and so for me, I would be cautious about saying that one side simply needs to defeat the other, that a military victory might end one phase of the fighting, but it would not bring or necessarily produce a stable Sudan. One of the dangers is that, if there's a battlefield victory, it's going to leave a really, really fragmented country, right? More so than now. And new patterns of exclusion and grievance and unresolved questions about who has the right and legitimacy to govern will emerge. It could be exhaustion. It could be a military stalemate, but regardless of how the actual violence ends, there needs to be a durable peace. And that really will happen beyond the fighting. It requires addressing the underlying political questions that help produce the conflict in the first place, the future of the armed forces, civilian governance, accountability, economic power, and the relationship between the state and the competing centers of power. One thing that this research has made clear is that some organized networks are already thinking about what comes after the war, and they're not waiting for a ceasefire to begin positioning themselves. Various actors are already, really competing to sort of think about this. In particular, reporting suggests that actors linked to, some of the former order are rebuilding influence, mobilizing supporters, supporting military formation. There's research out there that really has, they've done on-the-ground interviews and research. They're promoting a preferred model in which the army governs, even through an extended stabilization period before elections. Whether or not that specific vision succeeds, really, it doesn't get to that point. How do we really, tackle some of those root causes? And that's why I think it's important to distinguish between sort of an end of this violence and fighting and a real end of the crisis to take Sudan forward. And I think that's the real thing. One of the policy implications of the report is that international actors should expect those hardliners, to really insert themselves. And so, a conversation about a ceasefire between the two needs to also involve, obviously, enduring peace. What does the political future of Sudan look like along with civil society? For me, I think the report highlights that faith-based actors are already playing a really important role in civilian protection, mediation, information sharing, advocacy, peace building. And so for me, these are not hypothetical interventions, but they're happening now. And that's what we really need to be thinking about, including those communities. As Mohamed mentioned, they're already having these conversations. We need to be having conversations with them, right? Because at some point, we're going to have to engage. We're going to have to really think about what the future, when I say we, I mean it's sort of the royal we, what the future of Sudan looks like. And so for me, I think, the ceasefire, critical, important, and to the violence, people need to live their daily lives. But really, the focus must be on what the future, how do you end that crisis? And for me, one of the things that became clear is that the faith-based actors are already doing a lot of that critical work, and we need to tap into that. We need to listen to them and bring them into the conversation.
Thanks, Janette. We're getting some good questions in, so let me just transition to bringing in a couple of these questions, and then I perhaps have a couple more of my own if needed. But again, if you have a question, feel free to type it, click on that Q&A button and type it in there, and we'll review it and present it to our panelists. Mohamed mentioned the broader regional and global dynamics here, so there's a couple of questions that touch on that point. One audience member says, can any of the panel members say something about the issue of regional and global support for the SAF and for the RSF? And then relatedly, another questioner asks, what about the influence of outsiders, the UAE in particular? And what about outside eyes on Sudanese resources? She says, not sure religion has any role in any of this. So outsiders, and then particularly the attention to resources in Sudan. Any panelists want to offer some thoughts in response?
I was waiting Palwasha to jump in, but I can mention the regional dynamic. This is something that I mentioned in my opening remarks, that unfortunately Sudan is the victim of the regional dynamics, and not only regional, actually global dynamic in that sense, and that is because for certain reasons in Sudan as a country, the kind of political situation as well, Sudan, kind of geographical location as a country, very strategic. The resources in Sudan are just tremendous there as well. And of course, that's why you will see this fighting in Sudan. And there are regions, whether it is Africa or in the Middle East, or even our own nation here, and as well as Russia and China and all of this, they have an interest in Sudan. And that is for some reason that's actually fueled this particular problem in Sudan. For the fighting to stop, we have to stop all of this international interference in Sudan. I mean, if that did not stop, then the violence will never stop. I think that these are just realities, and the people continue to suffer in the country. That's why I think, as Janette was, saying earlier, this is kind of the forgotten, the global humanitarian disaster. We don't have a humanitarian disaster like what's happening in Sudan, but unfortunately, the globe is not paying attention to that. You're talking about 16.5 million people that are, internally or refugees, internally displaced people or refugees. I think that is, I hope that the international community acknowledge that and stop actually supporting the entities in Sudan.
Thanks, Mohammed. Any other thoughts in response to the regional or global or resource dimensions of the conflict? If not, we have some other questions that we can pose to you. One questioner asks about the ethnic element, ethnic and racial element here. I understand part of the conflict is against those who are considered Arab. Is that so? If so, please elaborate. We touched on some of the complexity, regional, ethnic, linguistic in Sudan, but anyone want to discuss the kind of Arab versus sort of Black African dynamic in the country?
Yeah. So I mean, Janet, please go ahead. Go ahead, please.
No, I was actually going to defer to you for really those intercommunal dynamics in the country.
Yeah, yeah. So, again, just going back to the nature of the Sudanese people and the social fabric in Sudan. Arab versus African, or the issue of race and racism was never a question, in the past. But unfortunately, because of the war, again, these are concepts that are being exploited for political and kind of military gains, unfortunately. But that was never a question before that. But now we see that basically happening in the country. Again, these are social situations and fabrics that really need to be addressed. And that's why I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks the critical role of religious actors in terms of how they can actually help to address some of these questions coming, because hate speech, the issue of race, Arab versus Africans, all of these are the religious leaders they have the right, kind of platforms and podiums to address those issues. And people listen to them because they are trusted and credible, right? But if we are not actually equipping religious actors to play that role, we're going to continue to see that polarization and these questions of racism and Arab versus African is always, exploited.
I think the only thing I'd add here is to say that I would be very cautious about reducing it to that. There is a history in Darfur, but I would be very cautious about reducing the entire conflict to this dimension of Arab versus Black African, and to remind and to remember that this is primarily about power and armed institutions and territory and resources. And as my co-panelists have mentioned, yes, there are very, very regional dynamics that become instrumentalized. And so we've got to sort of think about, how it's being utilized. And also as part of the peace process, making sure that all of the grievances are actually addressed so that you can sort of develop an enduring type of peace in the country.
Just maybe I could just add to what Janet was saying earlier about this question of Arab. And again, I will tell you a story of Arab and Africans. If you remember, during the Bush administration, when late General Colin Powell was the Secretary of State, he traveled to Darfur. If you remember that, he traveled to Darfur and he sat under the trees with people in Darfur. And then he came back home here in the United States and he said, I was looking around to see who is Arab and who is not Arab. These are the same skin. He said, I couldn't even figure out. That is Colin Powell was saying that who is Arab and who is non-Arab. So that's why that question really is not there, and it should not, as Janet's saying, the conflict should not be reduced to that.
Thank you. There's a question about how to engage with groups that might be more radical or violent or extremist. This questioner asks, in localized grounds, do you see any opportunities for willingness to form temporary pragmatic alliances with radical extremist factions to address and form faith and peace mediation efforts within countries? Any thoughts in terms of how to, either within Sudan or perhaps Palwasha, And Mohammed, examples from other contexts where you bring in people who've been directly involved in the fighting or who have what might be perceived as more radical or extreme views in a conflict situation.
I can start with looking at it in a more broader context. I know locally it really depends on where the alliances lie and what can be done with local commonalities that can help move mediation or a peace process forward. And as an outsider, it's not something for someone from the outside to really decide. It's something that locally communities come up with in terms of, what are some of the acceptable boundaries and where the red lines are in terms of working with communities that may be considered more radical. But then it's according to whose definition of radical and what have they done. And if there's been community atrocities, it's the communal consensus on whether it's something that they can move forward with and form, networks where they can work towards resolving some of the conflict and coming towards reconciliation or not at the local level. So it's not something that there's a broad answer for, but it really comes from localized decisions and communities themselves making those decisions and deciding where their red lines are and where are the places that they can continue to work together to work towards reconciliation, towards ending violence within their own communities.
Thanks, Palwasha. Mohammed, how about from the experience of your network with bringing in to mediation processes, those might be perceived as violent or radical or extreme?
Mm-hmm. So as we speak, just right now, in fact, next week, we're gathering what we call them, kind of traditional and faith-oriented insider mediators to kind of equip them and give them the training they need and see how they can, help in 4 countries, that including Sudan. So it's Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia as well, and Somalia. So they're meeting in Addis Ababa in a week or so just to have that discussion. And I saw the list. There are Sudanese, there as well. So we hope these small efforts could help address those issues as well. One of the points I really want to make here from our own experience is that the influence of the leaders of different Sufi orders and religious actors is really yet to be utilized to help in advancing peace and stability. Palwasha did a wonderful job in kind of, looking into the landscape of the religious communities in Sudan and all of that. But I think there is an influence. I just tell you another story. I was meeting with the head of the Tijaniya movement in Nigeria, very influential person, Sheikh Pucci, and he told me that when the situation in Darfur, this is like talking about 10 years ago, probably less than that, and Hemeti himself was sent by General Bashir to go to Darfur and address the issue of the conflict in Darfur. So this Sheikh Tijaniya from Nigeria, he said, Hemeti brought them from Africa, the leaders of the Sufi movement in the region in Africa, to Darfur to help actually talk to the Tijaniya in Darfur so that they can reduce some of the violence that was happening at the time. So, and he said, it went very well. We were able to do that using our own, religious influence. We're in the same Sufi order and things like that. So I think that role, is somehow still probably we need to look into it to see how some of these leaders could also help stability in Sudan.
And then I'd like to just add one thing. I think my colleagues, handled the question beautifully. But I guess the other thing is, for those that are perceived as hardliners, they have to be understood. They have to be mapped. You have to understand what they want. You have to understand how they can help or be spoilers, right? How they can undermine agreements, how they can mobilize constituencies. And so, you can't just ignore certain groups. You also have to be cautious about bringing groups in, but sometimes you've got to engage, even if it's through back channels, the various spaces, so that you really do understand, as I keep sort of emphasizing, that it is about, ending the current active violence, but it's about also a sustainable kind of peace.
Hey, thank you, Janette. That's a good segue to my final question for all of you, and that's looking ahead, what can be done. Thanks to our audience members for your questions. We got to most of the questions. And Janette, I'll start with you, and then I want to hear from Mohamed and Palwasha as well. We have just a few minutes left, and maybe 1 minute per panelist. But Janette, your report concludes with some kind of recommendations or policy points for the United States, for other international actors. What can they be doing to make some sort of positive difference in a really bleak situation in Sudan? You've served on the Hill, served at the State Department. You're at a global university now. What would be your 1, 2, 3 practical things that the U.S. or other international actors can do to make a positive difference?
You can't really answer that without feeling a certain way about our current situation. And I really was on the Hill at a time when we were heavily engaged. I mean, I've been to Sudan a couple of times, on Codels. I went after 2019 when everything, everyone was excited. We, in the middle of that transition, we held a hearing on the Hill. So, I think a couple of different things. I think the first is sometimes I feel disappointed by the fact that I'm wondering continually, where's this attention? I mean, we had high level attention on Sudan, right? And I understand we've got sort of domestic, concerns right now. But it does concern me. It really does concern me. And so I think the first is, really, I don't want to reiterate too much, what I offered up in the report, but for me, it really is supporting what's happening locally. I think the faith-based groups have shown themselves to, really be protecting civilians, to really be thinking about ceasefires, to really be thinking about, how to work across the groups, and supporting that. I really do think that you can't just come in and say, oh, faith-based religion, taking the time in the way that my colleagues have said, to really map and understand what's happening on the ground. Let the solutions come from, on the ground, from the experts that really know what's happening. So for me, not I've been, this is why I'm letting my colleagues really answer those questions from on the ground, not letting those sort of big Washington, D.C. kind of ideas and policy decisions, just sort of come. We must engage with actors on the ground. And I think, really, sorry, you said, you said 1 minute. Religion is not just religion, right? You have to really take and look at the context. That's my first point. The second point, I'm an anthropologist. I tried to do this in the report, really keeping the focus on the people, what they're suffering, how in the future their lives can be better. I mean, for me, that's what's key. How do we make their lives better?
Thanks, Janette. And Palwasha, Mohamed, just very briefly, if you can, 1 or 2 things that the U.S. or other international actors can do. Palwasha, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Judd. So things that I'm hearing from religious actors is that religion has to be treated as part of Sudan's peace infrastructure, not just as a source of risk. And that religious actors are already helping people survive through war, through their mosques, the zawiyas, churches, community shelters. But we also talked about the work that they were doing in mediation and the moral guidance. So if Sudan is to avoid returning to violence, we need to work with those trusted local institutions. They need to be connected to peace building, humanitarian access, trauma healing, and reconciliation efforts. Second, the religious narratives need to be reclaimed from militarization. This war has shown how religious language can be used to justify violence, to mobilize fear, to frame one side as illegitimate. But Sudan's religious traditions also contain powerful resources for protecting life, for talking about dignity, mercy, forgiveness, coexistence, and justice. And we need to work with religious leaders to support that ways that they can publicly articulate those values to delegitimize revenge and then also help communities imagine a shared future. And finally, religious actors themselves need to organize, and we need to support the ways that they are organized, as Mohamed Elsanousi mentioned, through the network and others, that they can organize across the divisions. And that means that intra-Muslim dialogues among Sufis, among Salafis, among Islamists, among reformist actors, and interfaith dialogue with Christians and indigenous communities, as well as making sure there's inclusion of women and youth as religious voices need to happen. And it can't be just symbolic. It should be practical. There should be practical mechanisms. We need to map who's influential, who's doing what kind of legitimacy they have, and how they're connected to their local communities, so that we can form a credible national religious platform that's independent of the state and that religious leaders can connect to, so that they can support formal peace processes and ceasefire processes. So the larger point is that I don't think Sudan can be stabilized just by elite political agreements. We need to have communities work with trusted actors that are religious, that help rebuild a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, and safe spaces after the war. And religious leaders are not just a substitute for political settlement, but they are essential to whether that settlement can become socially legitimate and whether communities can resist being pulled back into violence.
Thank you, Palwasha. Mohamed, any final thought you want to leave us with?
Oh, thank you so much. Palwasha did a wonderful job capturing all the points I want to make here, but I'm going to leave you with a couple of points. One is that we need to look into some priorities. I think that the priority number one now for the Sudanese people is the humanitarian disaster. And I think the international community, the globe, need to find the best way to support this, the biggest humanitarian disaster in the world today. I think that's number one priority. Second priority is that, unfortunately, you ask about the United States, right? So, Janet, I'm going to say it. Unfortunately, United States is not considering Sudan as a priority country right now. And therefore, the special envoy for Africa, who is dealing with Sudan, I don't think is a priority for him or for this administration as well. Sudan is not a priority, unfortunately, to engage. Even when you talk to our engagement at the United States in the Quad, but we're not making Sudan as a priority country so that we can resolve the problem. You remember when Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, visited here and spoke with Trump and all of that. And Trump said he's going to give some attention to it. And I wrote a piece with Representative French Hill here in the Washington Times, actually appealing to Trump to make some couple of calls to have Sudan as a priority country. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And then lastly, currently, in the past, the United Nations representative for especially envoy to Sudan not necessarily had a good relationship with Sudanese government or people or RSF or anybody, but the current special representative of the United Nations, Pekka Haavisto, he knows Sudan very well. He has a personal relationship with all of these factions in Sudan. I think this is an opportunity now. That's, I think, if he can engage in any political kind of solution to the country. So thank you so much. I will leave it at that.
Oh, thank you, Mohamed. Well, I'm very grateful to our panelists. Thank you, Janette, Mohamed, Palwasha, for being with us today. Thank you, Palwasha, for having the idea for this RPAC on Sudan in the first place. Thank you, Janette, for writing it and giving us all this to discuss. Mohamed, for all that you've done and all that you've shared today. Very grateful to all of you. Thankful also to our audience. Thanks for indulging us going over a few minutes like this, but obviously an important topic. We wanted to hear all of these insights. And a special thanks to my Berkley Center colleagues who made this possible, especially to Lily Meyer, who's our events and office coordinator for a few more hours. This is her very last day at the Berkley Center. She's been just a tremendous asset to us. We're sad to see her go, but law school awaits her. We wish her all the best. Lily, thank you for all that you've done to put together this event and so many events during your time at the Berkley Center. Thank you. Thanks to all involved. We'll see you next time.